Hey everyone, my name is Anna Carter Florence. I'm Peter Marshall Professor of Preaching at Columbia Theological Seminary. I am incredibly excited because today I get to have a conversation with my dear friend, Dr. Jerusha Mattson-Neal, who is Assistant Professor of Homiletics at Duke Divinity School and was recently the preacher for the Just Creation Conference and preached a sermon that afterwards my colleague Jake Myers and I, he's my colleague in homiletics, turned to each other and said, we think that's the best sermon we've ever heard.
Oh my goodness.
It was just so extraordinary. So what a gift as someone who loves preaching to be able to sit down with the preacher and talk a little bit about the sermon. Jerusha, first of all, thanks for being willing to do this.
Oh, it's a joy. It's a joy. Thank you.
It's been a few months
That's right.
we preached it, so we're
right.
reconstructing. And but I understand you've just preached from Ezekiel again. So
I know, twice in a year. I mean, my goodness, that's.
I would love to talk about that too. I'm assuming that was in Duke Chapel.
That's right.
Right. Okay. Well, Dr. Neal, aside from thanking you again for this time. When you were invited to be the preacher for this conference, which was you were the person everybody we all wanted and were thrilled to be able to invite, and that you said yes, you came back with this wonderful text that you said you wanted to work with in Ezekiel. And it wasn't Ezekiel 37, the dry bones, which is the one that most of us at some point as preachers have worked with, or at least heard. It's the familiar one. Can you tell us something about why you went for this unexpected choice for this conference?
Well, part of it was looking at the speakers that you had and the conversations you were convening. This wasn't just generally about creation care, it was about just creation. And so the conference was looking at some really specific questions about the intersections of militarism and government-sponsored forced displacement with ecological threat. And there's something about Ezekiel where the threat of military empire and the impact of that on ecological life is so bright. That just never goes out of focus. And the other thing I noticed in the lineup of speakers is there was a real emphasis on urban ecology. So it's possible in a creation care conference to really focus on agrarian life, and those are all really important conversations to have. But this particular conference, as you're there in Atlanta, just had its focus on what does this mean for the city? And those last 9 chapters in Ezekiel, where he has this vision of the temple and this new city after the destroyed city, it's sort of a provocative choice because eco-theologians and eco-biblical scholars haven't quite known what to do with that. They would rather he stay in the woods, right? They would rather him stay, in the sort of the garden. And yet here he is in a city. And is it possible to talk about ecological justice in ways that touch down in urban environments? There's one more reason that it drew my eye, and it's the bigness of the questions in Ezekiel. There are absolutely no easy answers, no false hope, certainly. And I think it presses us, particularly those that have worked around climate justice issues for a while, into these questions of what difference does Scripture make? What difference does God make in this fight? And then what difference do we make? It was a rather fraught moment in Atlanta when the Just Creation Conference happened. If you remember,
Yes, it was. There were protests going on.
Correct.
And, violence right down the street, a death right down the street.
That's right. Manuel Paez-Terán had just been shot by police in Milani Forest, protesting the construction of the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. Just all of that was right present with us at that conference. And so I thought we needed a text Not that scripture ever really provides easy answers, but I needed a text that actually actively resisted domestication. And Ezekiel does that.
That is for sure. And it was such a revelation listening to that particular text, which isn't one I've ever worked with, except in discussing the worship service ahead of time with you, how intersectional it is.
That's right.
You know, and the protester in Atlanta who was killed was a trans person. So there were all kinds of layers going on in the context at that moment that were all wrapped up. And we so often, I think of the Bible as this kind of pastoral agrarian vision or picture of life, and city life, you really reached into the depth, and it was almost like the things Ezekiel was describing were things that we were seeing and living.
You know, I mean, one of the most important things that you teach in a preaching class is not to make these sort of easy, direct links between a kind of literal reading of the text, and then we're jumping thousands of years and we're doing a literal reading again and making these easy links. I mean, all of that, absolutely, I agree with. But I think there's a way in which the issue with climate, particularly for people who have privilege and access and power, there's a way in which we can use that sort of nervousness about making a link in ways that actually are self-serving, because there's a lot of stuff in there about power and protest and naming very concretely the ways that economic injustice, military injustice, imperial ideology, all of that leads to the climate crisis. Yeah.
And I just remember how specific Ezekiel is. I mean, that was one of the striking things about that text. He doesn't, I mean, he is the huge questions, but he's also the micro details, you know, in terms of,
that's right.
Every single tribe is going to be important.
That's right.
And the widows and orphans are going to be, the aliens among us are going to be important. This all has to be structured because of who human beings are. That was really a striking thing.
That's right. And that gets very concrete at the end of 47 and 48. Yeah, I mean that that the book ends with the redistribution of land. I mean, okay, what are we going to take that with some weight? What does that mean? I mean, in Atlanta, where we were actually talking about raising a forest to build kind of a military training, empty city. I mean, this, I'll tell you, one of the reasons I was drawn to this pericope, very oddly, is I was thinking about what it means to build a city where no one will live, but will simply be used for training exercises, an empty city. And I got to thinking about the sort of haunted feeling of that. You know, you sort of walk through an empty streets unless they're sort of filled with training, kind of. And the juxtaposition, the contrast, but also the protest of this kind of very strangely haunted empty city that Ezekiel describes, which is different, right? It's a different kind of haunted, empty city. But I mean, it's haunted by grief. People that should be there working and praying, and you know, humans show up sort of in bits and pieces. You know, at the very end of the river in the distance, you see some people fishing. I mean, it's a very, and this question of what do these two cities have to say to each other? Because Babylon built its own sort of structures for military parades and military. I mean, this was the question that kind of brought, it was that sort of specificity, I guess, that brought this pericope to mind.
You know, it's just, this is another thing we always say in preaching classes, that the more specific you are, the more it really actually ends up speaking, not universally, but across many possible or into many possible contexts and audiences. And that was so remarkable, and how this happened at this particular time in Atlanta with your presence here. Did you have any surprises as you were working with this text that took you in some interesting angles that you weren't expecting to maybe go?
I mean, one thing I'll say that I need to just own up to is that I've been working with this text for some time for a book I'm writing on the importance of displaced communities and displaced voices. So I didn't just, dive into this text and with a week's time. It's been marinating in me for a while.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you that I remember viscerally the moment it hit me that last line in the book, the name of the city, the Lord is there. When it hit me, the grief of that line, and how much you would really want Ezekiel to be present in the hope, in the moment, but for the name of the city to be, as Ezekiel is there looking at it, the Lord is here. And yet that's not what Ezekiel says. Is you have this whole, he's bodily present, he's in the river, he's got all this stuff, and then all of a sudden at the end, the Lord is there, meaning Ezekiel is thrown bodily back on the banks of a different river. And it was like that experience. I'm going to date myself, but when you watch the piano and the very end of the piano, and you think she's made it in the boat, right, to safety. And then there's the last picture of the movie, she's fallen off the boat and she's drowned and she's sort of in limbo, held underwater. You can look it up if you want to see it. But I had that experience that Ezekiel is in limbo there at the end, neither here nor there. And then I had this profound, out of that ache, which is very much the ache of the climate crisis, right? Like it's this hope that seems so improbable given where our feet are located. And in fact, the hope itself says that the Lord is far off, right, in the midst of this crisis. I had this insight about preaching. And I remember thinking to myself, what if this city is a sermon and the name, this whole vision is proclamation, and the name of this city, the Lord is there, is a promise made from the place of hope back into the place of crisis. This kind of thrownness of a God that doesn't locate God's self within the golden-hued vision, but alongside the banks of an exiled people in a dirty, sort of muddy irrigation ditch that had been built to, serve the upper class of the Babylonian Empire. The Lord is there, the city says, back to Ezekiel. Yeah. And I think that disorientation that I felt in reading that final line, the ambivalence of it, the lack of resolution in it, to me, that said something true, I think, about how you preach in the midst of this crisis. That there is both, yes, a pointing toward, and also the recognition that God feels very absent, and that one of the most powerful, I think, proclamations of a preacher in this moment is God's grief and vulnerability to this crisis alongside us.
Yeah. And I remember as you and Dr. Rebecca Spurrier and I were talking about planning worship, we wanted to make it visceral, even in the space.
That's right.
I don't think I've ever brought in so much trash to a sanctuary to, I mean, we were trying to really take seriously that image of the ditch, and
Yeah.
worshiping in a place without this water, which is the reality.
Yes,
So many places,
that's right.
right in our city. But when we go inside a church, it's not always visible to us. And you made it so visible in the word that you were preaching, but then also in your sensitivity about what we needed to have around us in order to do that. It was really
Well,
good.
let's just say that was Rebecca Spurrier, and your own sensitivity too. We because this is an unfamiliar passage, right? And so part of, I think, the work with dealing with the passage that doesn't get preached on much is you do have to take some time to orient people. The visuals helped so much that this whole team that was putting together the space thought about how is it that we make it really clear where Ezekiel is standing when this vision is pronounced. In many ways, the proclamation began the minute they walked into the sanctuary and saw the space itself. So, I mean, that really is a gift that the whole team brought to this sermon.
Well, it's also a lovely reminder that preaching happens within this whole context of sensitivity and planning. I mean, not that we want to get all precious about worship, but that to take risks.
Yeah.
Not only with the preached word, but with the visuals.
That's
Nothing that we had in that sanctuary was unfamiliar. It was stuff we all see every day. We just don't necessarily see it right in front of us. It's clear that preaching about this environmental crisis is more necessary than ever. And it is painful, as you said, not only to God, but to the listener, to the preacher. And do you have pastoral wisdom to offer for preachers who want to do more of this?
Yeah. So there's kind of two sections to this question, and there's like logistics and how to talk about it with your congregation, and there's that kind of stuff that but I want to speak specifically to that pastoral ache that you name. It's painful. It's hard. There's a class that Ellen Davis and I teach here at Duke on preaching about hope in the climate crisis, and there's a question mark behind that hope. Like, is this even possible? And, when the class begins, students name all of the reasons that they're scared to talk about this because of their congregations. Oh, our congregation this, my congregation that, my congregation doesn't understand, politicized, whatever, we need to deal with other issues. I mean, there's a whole list. It is not long in the class before it really crystallizes to, I'm actually really afraid to talk about this. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say about God. And I think the first thing that I would tell preachers is that we have actually been gifted a sacred text where these big questions are precisely at the heart. These questions about where is God when the ground under our feet shifts? Where is God when it feels like covenant and creation are unraveling? Where is God when everything we thought we could count on is unstable? And so I think the first thing I would say is there's much more of a resource in the book that we work from to not be afraid of the big questions. God's people have been in similar kinds of apocalyptic places before. They have. There's God's people now that are experiencing these apocalypses in ways that are less insulated than many of our congregations. And they have moved past fear to a pressing forward into the questions they need to know the answers to. And so, I mean, that's the first thing I would say. You have more wisdom in the book than you think you do, if you have eyes to see. The second thing I would say is I think it's really important when we preach on this to braid it together with the big, meaty themes, theological words, depth, within the tradition that we preach out of. I think when you're coming into something that is as big as the climate crisis, and you're coming at it with sort of bullet points of these are sort of how public policy tweaks kind of thing. Not that public policy is unimportant, it is. But what you say can feel so thin in relation to the depth of the grief. And so I would really want to encourage people, there's not just one way to do this, there's many ways to braid this with large theological themes. But I mean, these words about new creation, these words about reconciliation, atonement, incarnation, covenant, what would it mean to think about those weighty theological concepts in light of climate catastrophe? What would that mean? I actually think, rather than pressing people sort of out into such deep waters that they don't know what to do, I think part of what happens there is, we've had these deep dialectics between despair and hope that go all the way back. I mean, not just to the cross, but to Ezekiel's river and before that, right? And I think when you finally, it's like when you're sinking down in deep water and you're not sure there's going to be a bottom, and then you touch bottom and you think, oh, there's sediment here. We've talked about this before. There's something to push up on, but it's got to be big. And I think there's something related to that in what I'll say next, which is this rejection both of false hope that is too small, that is too trite, that is too, hey, we're going to fix it with a little bit of razzle dazzle, like that thing, that's not flying anymore for anybody, right? But also a kind of easy despair, a throwing up one's hands, a kind of relinquishing of responsibility. Chuck Campbell, his book, Scandal of the Gospel, last chapter in that book, he deals with the climate crisis. And then he does this, interestingly, he does two things. He brings together an exilic text, the prophet Joel, with a theological reframing of deep incarnation. So he does just the thing I'm talking about here, okay? And he moves from sort of false hope and false despair to this question that is right at the heart of Joel, which is, who knows? Who knows? We repent, we change, and yet finally God is free. God is not a puppet on a string. Who knows? And in that question, as scary as that is, there is a kind of remembering, deep remembering of who we are as God's creatures, that we actually are not masters of the universe, right? For all of our power in the Anthropocene, that finally what we are discovering is we are quite small. And what would it mean to live like that again, to live connected, relational, remember that again? I think preachers have something to say about that, but they gotta get down, right, to that place where they remember their vulnerability as a creature created by God.
Some of what I hear you saying, and this is so powerful, is preachers have a particular role that they already know how to do.
That's right.
It just has to be entered into in light of, this is the other thing I hear you saying, environmental catastrophe. The word catastrophe really has to be leaned into.
That's
this
right.
This is not just a problem. It's not just injustice, although it is completely that. It is apocalyptic, and it is our context. And so we have, even there,
that's
resources, right. Even there, but we have to go there.
That's right.
And I think that is, as you were saying, incredibly hard. But it may be that preachers can provide, can help shepherd, can help guide people as we all enter into this space. You know.
Absolutely. I actually think it's kind of a relief, particularly when you ground it in biblical texts that people have some knowledge of, right? That this is somehow a story that I have been included in some way, right? Right. So this is not, I think there is something about finally naming what's at stake in the question. And that we've been here before. I will say another reason why it's hard, and I can't speak for all congregations here. I speak out of sort of my most intimate knowledge with sort of white mainline spaces, predominantly white. I think one of the reasons why it's hard to go there, yes, because of grief, lament, scary, all of that, but also because some of our churches are really comfortable in seeing themselves in control of history and place and land, and we can make this work for us, and we can make creation do what we want it to do. And that's not true everywhere, of course, but I think there's a deep invitation to let go of some of those false patterns that are so deeply embedded in the DNA of our country and history of colonialism, all that stuff, that's in there. I know that sounds sort of theoretical for preachers, like I'm just getting up to talk about, taking better care of our, energy as a church. But this deep question of, to what extent can I determine the fates around me? To what extent can I control this world that God has given me? To be part of my identity, really. I mean, that's a fair, we're getting into deep waters, and partly why so many of these questions are deeply intersectional, right? Around racial injustice, climate, all of that. It has to do with control.
It does.
Yeah.
And the American dream, which is such a, every time we head into this time of year and we think about elections either coming up or imminent. I mean, we face this again, and it is so deep, and it is like nationally the first thing that needs to be deconstructed pastorally in a way that so that we can ask the really big questions, as you say. And that is, there is absolutely no support for that in the culture to do. So, it is, as you say, letting go of enormous things. Enormous things. Tricia, do you have some other ideas about best practices for preachers who want to educate themselves more about doing this kind of preaching? We've talked about some of the pitfalls of falling into false hope. I mean, some of this is just getting incredibly gutsy, right? Getting if for the first time getting used to what it is to fly blind in the pulpit, or to fly without a lot of safety nets. But do you have other wisdom that people can kind of practically take, preachers?
So this is not one and done kind of stuff. I mean, really what you're ultimately working on is, I mean, imagine a tree, and there's like roots in the tree, and then there's branches. And a lot of us think of ecology as one of a whole bunch of branches that we can talk about on a Sunday. We could talk about, racial justice or economic justice. We can talk about ecology. It's over here. What we're really talking about is relocating this connection to creation, a kind of covenantal understanding of what it means to be human, all the way to the root of how it is that we make sense of our faith. All of that to say that this is not going to be one sermon.
It's not a
And
sermon on recycling.
no. I mean, it doesn't have to be. This theme, when you start looking for it, even if you're a lectionary preacher, is all over the place. It's all over the place. I really do think having conversations outside of just the sermonic moment is really helpful. One of the assessments we had in this class that we teach at Duke is we have students preach a climate sermon in the church where they're doing their field work. But then part of what we asked them to do is do a feedback session after with sort of a group of congregation members where they really talk through, what did you appreciate? What questions did you have? Where were the resistances? All these kinds of things, right? Just to get feedback for the preacher. How does this land? What was striking about those conversations, and North Carolina has a whole spectrum of sort of perspectives on this issue. So these are not kind of monolithic congregations. What surprised preachers regularly was how ready people were to talk about it, particularly when it was framed around biblical sort of deep questions around limit and loss, questions about God, questions about our responsibility as creatures in God's world. I mean, when you framed those things with this deep rooted solidity in the soil of people's faith and ground, the distance that some of these feedback groups were willing to travel to imagine new ways of forming community, next steps, it was rather remarkable. We were surprised too as instructors. We weren't sure what was going to happen there. So I want to just name some sort of books that are good for sort of starting conversations too. I mean, I think the biblical text, particularly the exilic text and context, like that's a wonderful place to start with your congregations. You can buy some books, get, shore up about, okay, what did this mean when God's people were seeing the loss of land and displacement? What were the questions they're asking?
It's a good reason to get back into Hebrew Bible, Old Testament in a new
That's
way.
right. That's right. Though, of course, this also continues in the New Testament. There's a great new book out by Preston Burroughs that talks about the agricultural practices of the Roman Empire and how it impacts the writing of Romans. So, I mean, this whole thing of imperial displacement is all over the place. But probably that's not the book you're going to do the conversation with the congregation about. Probably there's something a little more concrete. And I really like books that make the contemporary connection, which is such a biblical connection, between exploitation of people and exploitation of land. When land is exploited, people are exploited. Non-human creation, human creation. When human creation is exploited, lo and behold, non-human creation is exploited. I mean, that link is made all over the place in Scripture. Someone who's making that link in contemporary contexts now, I think of Heather McTeer Toney, who's an African-American woman. A recent book is When the Streetlights Come On, and she talks very specifically about climate change and structural racism and how these two are connected. Stephen Charleston has a new book out. He's a retired Episcopal priest and a Choctaw elder, and his book is We Survive the End of the World, Lessons from Native America on Apocalypse and Hope. There are also books that, for congregations that are just beginning to have this conversation. Catherine Hayhoe's work, Saving Us, is just about how to get conversations started on this when maybe it's a scary thing to enter into it. For folks that have been doing the work a little longer, there's a beautiful anthology, All We Can Save, that I just think is organized beautifully. It has it's sort of short essays in different genres that sort of, again, braid together kind of story, meditation, scientific essay, like just it's beautifully arranged. Those are just some places to begin. And that doesn't even touch some of the more concrete, once you've had some conversation, the next step then is to have some conversation about, in our particular context and place, what are some changes we could make? So There Is No Planet B, for example, that was written out a couple of years ago. But there's a number of also those kind of books that can help you take the more concrete next step of what does that mean for how we're making decisions as a congregation together here. But the point is get talking. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
And I think the way that happens, what preaching can do is just encourage your people that God's people have had this conversation before. This is not new. And in fact, we have something to say here. So those are some of my thoughts.
Those are great suggestions. Just to get people started, that there are tons of resources out there. And then you and I both happen to be married to pastors, people we met in seminary.
That's true.
Yeah. And then this is I know that your spouse Wes has been doing some of this, and mine David has been doing some of this in his congregation in Black Mountain Presbyterian Church. But something I've noticed is as they're educating themselves and the conversation gets going, which is rich and important and heartbreaking and necessary and leading in all kinds of really important directions. The preacher needs to take care of their own soul.
Yeah.
The grief is pretty profound.
That's right. That's right.
That would be another thing I would.
Okay, I'm going to name this book I read a couple years ago that I still carry. I kind of return to it. Not written by a person of faith, Lisa Wells. This is by her own account of time. Maybe she is now, but when she wrote the book, no. But she writes this book called Believers: Making a Life at the End of the World. And I was reading it alongside Chuck's work on grotesque hope in Scandal of the Gospel. And some of the pictures of sort of what belief in hope is like moving people to do in this season. Some of it's a little grotesque, but it's dogged and it's honest and it's unyielding. And my goodness, through the course of this book, she is wooed. She is wooed by these folks who have said, often because of some kind of a faith commitment or some kind of trust in something bigger than themselves, that this fight has meaning. And you see her writing herself back to a place of hope. And all of that to say, look for those books, find connection, find community, find conversation. For those folks who say, yeah, I know all the facts, and even so, life matters. Life matters. Yeah. And I think that's essential. Yeah.
That might be a beautiful place for us to close.
Okay.
I want to encourage everyone, if you haven't, to read the manuscript of Dr. Jerusha Matson-Neal's sermon for this conference, Just Creation, and to come back again to some of the incredible wisdom that you've offered us today, Jerusha. We didn't even get a chance to talk about your own story and, your teaching life that was prior to Duke and all the ways that impacted you. But, you have been having these conversations for years and years with deeply faithful people. And as you said, they are there. They're waiting for us to have them.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank
it's been
you.
great to speak with you today.
Oh, it's always a joy. Thank you. And we greatly appreciate and value your time. Thanks.